So, hello and welcome back yet again to another public domain work by Sir Walter Scott this time. I don't know what he did to get knighted, but he is a Sir. And it is Ivanhoe, which, according to its title page, promises us to be a romance. I'm dubious, but it is what it is. Ivanhoe, a romance. It is set back in the Middle Ages. I did a little bit of, checking into it. And evidently, Sir Walter Scott was a lawyer who then turned himself into an author. He wrote all sorts of things, narrative poems of action and adventure, The Lay of the Last Minstrel in 1805, Marmion in 1808, and The Lady of the Lake in 1810. I would like to track that one down. That would be interesting, although it's supposed to be a poetry thing, so I don't know. I've never really. Poetry is one of those things that's I'm always kind of iffy about. Sometimes I really like it, and sometimes I'm like, I don't get it. That's just a me thing, though. Anyway, he also published a novel called Waverley in 1814, and a bunch of like Scottish ones like Rob Roy, and then Ivanhoe, and all of these other books. But we're going to be concentrating on Ivanhoe. I'm a little scared of this because I feel like I'm going to get lost in the language because Old English is not exactly the most easy language to parse out. I also was doing a little bit of side research on this just to find out a little bit more about what sort of interesting ideas we're going to come across in this book. And it does seem like it's probably going to be a little bit on the not kind to the Jewish people because they were quite villainized back in those days. And there's a lot of probably going to be slurs thrown in periodically. I will try to point them out when I see them because that is not cool. Also, there's a lot of like hate between the English and the Saxons. I think the Saxons were the French, but I don't know. I'm not exactly up on my medieval history, but I guess we can all learn as we jump into Ivanhoe, which was published in 1819 by Sir Walter Scott, beginning with chapter 1. And it looks like every chapter is going to begin with some sort of interesting verse. So we will begin with that. Chapter 1. Thus communed these, well to their lowly dome, the full-fed swine returned with evening home, compelled reluctant to the several sights with din obstreperous and ungrateful cries from Pope's Odyssey. And that's what I mean about the whole Old English language. I'm probably going to butcher a lot of words. Anyway, chapter 1. In that pleasant district of merry England, which is watered by the river Don, there extended in ancient times a large forest covering the greater part of the beautiful hills and valley which lie between Sheffield and the pleasant town of Doncaster. The remains of this extensive wood are still to be seen at the noble seats of Wentworth, of Warncliffe Park, and around Rotherham. Here, haunted of yore, the fabulous dragon of Wantley, here were fought many of the most desperate battles during the civil wars of the Roses, And here also flourished in ancient times those bands of gallant outlaws whose deeds have been rendered so popular in English song. Such being our chief scene, the date of our story refers to a period towards the end of the reign of Richard I, when his return from his long captivity had become an event rather wished than hoped for by his despairing subjects, who were in the meantime subjected to every species of subordinate oppression. The nobles, whose power had become exorbitant during the reign of Stephen, and whom the prudence of Henry II had scarce reduced into some degree of subjugation to the crown, had now resumed their ancient license in its utmost extent, despising the feeble interference of the English Council of State, fortifying their castles, increasing the number of their dependents, reducing all around them into a state of vassalage, and striving by every means in their power to place themselves each at the head of such forces as might enable them to make a figure in the national convulsions which appeared to be impending. The situation of the inferior gentry, or Franklins as they were called, who, by the law and spirit of the English Constitution, were entitled to hold themselves independent of feudal tyranny, became now unusually pernicious. If, as was most generally the case, they placed themselves under the protection of any of the petty kings in their vicinity, accepted of the feudal offices in his household, or bound themselves by mutual treaties of alliance and protection to support him in his enterprises, they might indeed purchase temporary repose, but it must be with the sacrifice of that independence which was so dear to every English bosom, and at the certain hazard of being involved as a party in whatever rash expedition the ambition of their protector might lead him to do. On the other hand, such and so multiplied were the means of vexation and oppression possessed by the great barons, that they never wanted the pretext, and seldom the will, to harass and pursue, even to the very edge of destruction, any of their less powerful neighbors who attempted to separate themselves from their authority and to trust for their protection during the dangers of the times to their own inoffensive conduct and onto the law of the land. A circumstance which greatly tended to enhance the tyranny of the nobility and the sufferings of the inferior classes arose from the consequences of the conquest by Duke William of Normandy. 4 generations had not sufficed to blend the hostile blood of the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, or to unite by common language and mutual interest the two hostile races, one of which still felt the elation of triumph, while the other groaned under all the consequence of defeat. The power had been completely placed in the hands of the Norman nobility by the events of the Battle of Hastings, and it had been used, as our histories assure us, with no moderation. The whole race of Saxon princes and nobles had been expurgated or disinherited, with few or no exceptions, nor were the numbers great who possessed land in the country of their fathers, even as the proprietors of the second or of yet inferior classes. The royal policy had long been to weaken by every means, legal or not, the strength of a part of the population which was justly considered as nourishing the most inveterate antipathy to the victor. All the monarchs of the Norman race had shown the most marked predilection for their Norman subjects. The laws of the chase, and many others equally unknown by the milder and more free spirit of the Saxon constitution, had been fixed upon the necks of the subjugated inhabitants to add weight, as it were, to the feudal claims with which they were loaded. At court, and in the castles of the great nobles, where the pomp and state of court were emulated, Norman French was the only language employed. In courts of law, the pleadings and judgments were delivered in the same tongue. In short, French was the language of honor, of chivalry, and even of justice, while the far more manly and expressive Anglo-Saxon was abandoned to the use of the rustics and the hinds who did not know any other. Still, however, the necessity of intercourse between the lords of the soil and those oppressed inferior beings by whom the soil was cultivated occasioned the gradual formulation of a dialect, compounded betwixt the French and the Anglo-Saxon, in which they could render themselves mutually intelligible to each other. And from this necessity arose by degrees the structure of our present English language, in which the speech of the victors and the vanquished have so happily blended together, and which has such been so richly improved by importations from the classical languages and from those spoken by the southern nations of Europe. This state of things I have thought it necessary to premise for the information of the general reader, who might be apt to forget that although no great historical events, such as war or insurrection, mark the existence of the Anglo-Saxons as a separate people subsequent to the reign of William II, yet the national distinctions between them and their conquerors, the recollection of what they had formerly been and to what they were now reduced, continued down the reign of Edward III, keeping open the wounds which the conquest had inflicted, and maintaining a line of separation between the descendants of the victor Normans and the vanquished Saxons. The sun was setting upon one of the rich glassy glades of the forest which we have mentioned in the beginning of this chapter. Hundreds of broad-headed, short-stemmed, wide-branched oaks, which had witnessed perhaps the stately march of Roman soldiers, flung their gnarled arms over a thick carpet of the most delicious green sward. In some places they were intermingled with beeches, hollies, and copsewood of various descriptions, so closely as to totally intercept the level beams of the sinking sun, and in others they receded from each other, forming those long sweeping vistas in the intricacy of which the eye delights to lose itself, while imagination considers them as paths to yet wilder scenes of sylvan solitude. Here, the red rays of the sun shot a broken and discolored light that partially hung upon the shattered boughs and mossy trunks of the trees, and there they illuminated in brilliant patches the portions of turf to which they made their way. A considerable open space in the middle of this glade seemed formerly to have been dedicated to the rites of druidical supersession, for on the summit of a hillock, so regular as to seem artificial, there still remained part of a circle of rough, unhewn stones of great dimension. 7 stood upright. The rest had been dislodged from their places, probably by the zeal of some convert to Christianity, and they lay, some prostrate or near their former site, and others on the side of the hill. One large stone only had found its way to the bottom, and in stopping the course of a small brook which glided smoothly round the foot of its eminence, gave by its opposition a feeble voice of murmur to the placid and elsewhere silent stream. The human figures which completed this landscape were in number 2, partaking in dress and appearance of that wild and rustic character which belonged to the woodlands of the West Riding of Yorkshire in that early period. The oldest of these men had a stern, savage, wild aspect. His garment was of the simplest form imaginable, being a close jacket with sleeves composed of the tanned skin of some animal on which the hair had originally left, but which had been worn off in so many places that it would have been difficult to distinguish from the patches that remained what creature the fur had originally belonged to. This primeval vestment reached from his throat to his knees and served at once all the usual purposes of clothing. There was no wider opening at the collar than was necessary to admit the passage of the head, from which it may be inferred that it was put on by slipping it over the head and shoulders in the manner of a modern shirt, or perhaps an ancient hauberk. Sandals, bound with thongs made of boar's hide, protected his feet, and a roll of thin leather was twined artificially round the legs, and descending above the calf, left the knees bare, like those of a Scottish Highlander. To make the jacket sit yet more close to the body, it was gathered at the middle by a broad leather belt, secured by a brass buckle, to one side of which was attached a sort of script, and to the other a ram's horn, accoutramented with a mouthpiece for the purpose of blowing. On that same belt was stuck one of those long, broad, sharp-pointed, double-edged knives with a buckhorn handle, which were fabricated in the neighborhood, and bore, even at this early period, the name of a Sheffield whittle. The man had no covering on his head, which was only defended by his own thick hair, matted and twisted together, and scorched by the sun into a rusty dark red color, forming a contrast with the overgrown beard on his cheeks, which was rather of a yellow or amberish hue. One part of his dress only remains, but it is too remarkable to be suppressed. It was a brass ring resembling a dog collar, but without any open, soldered fast round his neck, so loose as to form no impediment to his breathing, yet so tight as to be incapable of being removed, excepting by the use of a file. On this gorget was engraved in Saxon letters an inscription of the following purport: Gurth, the son of Beowulf, is the born thrall of Cedric of Rotherwood. Next to the swineherd, for that was Gurth's occupation, was seated upon one of the fallen Druid stones a person about 10 years younger in appearance, and whose dress, though resembling his companions in form, was better made and of more fantastic description. His jacket had been stained of a bright purple hue, upon which there had been some attempt to paint grotesque ornaments in different colors. To the jacket he added a short cloak, which scarce reached halfway down his thigh, of a crimson cloth, though very soiled, and lined with bright yellow, and as he could transfer it from one shoulder to another, or at his pleasure draw it around him, its width, contrasted with its want of longitude, formed quite the fantastic drapery. He had thin silver bracelets upon his arms, and on his neck a collar of the same metal, bearing the inscription, Wamba, the son of Witless, is the thrall of Cedric of Rotherwood. This personage had the same sort of sandals as his companion, but instead of the roll of leather thong, his legs were cased in sort of gaiters, one of which was red and the other which was yellow. He also had a cap, having around it more than one bell, about the size of those attached to hawks, which jingled as he turned his head from one side to the other, and as he seldom remained a minute in the same posture, the sound might be considered incessant. Around the edge of his cap was a stiff bandeau of leather, cut at the top into open work, resembling a coronet, while a prolonged bag arose from within it and fell down on one shoulder like an old-fashioned nightcap, or a jelly bag, or the headgear of a modern hussar. It was to this part of the cap that the bells were attached, which the circumstance, as well as the shape of his headdress, and his own half-crazed, half-cunning expression, sufficiently pointed him out as belonging to the race of domestic clowns or jesters maintained in the houses of the wealthy, to help while away the tedium of those lingering hours which they were obliged to spend indoors. He bore, like his companion, a scrip attached to his belt, but had neither horn nor knife, being probably considered as belonging to a class who it is esteemed dangerous to entrust with edged tools. In place of this, he was equipped with a sword of lath, resembling that with which a harlequin operates his wonders on the modern stage. In outward appearance of these men, they form scarce a stronger contrast to their look and demeanor. That of the serf or bondsman was sad and sullen, his aspect bent on the ground with an air of deep dejection, which might almost be construed into apathy. He had not the fire which occasionally sparked his red eye, manifesting that maybe inside there slumbered under the appearance of sullen despondency a sense of oppression, and maybe a disposition to resistance. The looks of Wamba, on the other hand, indicated, as usual with his class, a sort of vacant curiosity and fidgety impatience of any posture of repose, together with self-satisfaction respecting his own situation and the appearance that he made. The dialogue which they maintained between them was carried on in Anglo-Saxon, which, as we have said before, was universally spoken by the inferior classes, excepting the Norman soldiers and the immediate personal dependents of the great feudal nobles. But to give their conversation in that language would convey but little information to a modern reader, for whose benefit we will beg to offer this translation. "The curse of St. Withold upon those infernal porkers," said the swineherd, after blowing his horn to collect together his scattered herd of swine, which, answering his call with notes equally melodious, made, however, no haste to remove themselves from the luxurious banquet of beech nuts and acorns upon which they were fattened, or to forsake the marshy banks of the rivulet, where several of them, half plunged in the mud, lay stretched at their ease, altogether regardless of the voice of their keeper. "The curse of St. Withold upon them and upon me," said Gurth. "If the two-legged wolf snap had not up some of them ere nightfall, I am no true man. Here, Fangs, Fangs," he cried at the top of his voice to a ragged, wolfish-looking dog, a sort of lurcher, half mastiff, half greyhound, which ran limping around as if with the purpose of seconding his master in collecting up the grunters, but which in fact, from misapprehension of the swineherd's signals, ignorance of his own duty, or perhaps malice, only drove the pigs hither and thither, and increased the evil which he seemed to design to remedy. "A devil draw the teeth of him," said Gurth, "and the mother of mischief confound the ranger of the forest that cuts the foreclaws off our dog, and makes them unfit for their trade. Wamba, up and help me, and thou beast a man, take a turn round the back of the hill to gain the wind on them, and when thou'st got the weather gauge, thou mayest driveth them before thee as gently as many innocent lambs." "Truly," said Wamba, without moving from his spot, "I have consulted my legs upon this matter, and they are altogether of the opinion that to carry my gay garments through these sloughs would be an act of unfriendship to my sovereign person and royal wardrobe. Wherefore, Gurth, I advise thee to call off Fangs, and to leave the herd to their destiny, which, whether they meet with bands of traveling soldiers or outlaws, or of wandering pilgrims, can be little else than to be converted into Normans by morning, to thy no small ease and comfort, I'm sure." "The swine turn Normans to my comfort," said Gurth. "Expound that to me, Wamba, for my brain is too dull and my mind too vexed for riddles." "Why, how can you call those grunting brutes running about on their four legs?" said Wamba. "Swine, fool, swine," said the herdsman. "Every fool knows that." "And swine is good Saxton," said the jester. "But how call you the sow when she is flayed and drawn and quartered, and hung up by the heels like a traitor?" Pork, said the swineherd. I am very glad every fool knows that too, said Wamba. And pork, I think, is good Norman French. And so when the brute lives and is in charge of the Saxton slave, she goes by her Saxton name, but becomes a Norman and is called Pork when she is carried to the castle to feast among the nobles. What do you think of that, friend Girth, huh? It is but too true doctrine, friend Wamba, however it got into your fool's head. Nay, I can tell you more, said Wamba, in the same tone. There is old Alderman Ox. He continues to hold his Saxton epitaph while he is under the charge of serfs and bondsmen such as you, but becomes beef, a fiery French gallant, when he arrives before the worshipful jaws that are destined to consume him. Miner Calf, too, becomes Monsieur de Vaux in the like manner. He is Saxton when he requires tending, and takes a Norman name when he becomes a matter of enjoyment. By St. Dunstan, said Girth, thou speakest but sad truths. There is little left to us but the air we breathe, and that appears to have been reserved with much hesitation solely for the purpose of enabling us to endure the tasks they lay upon our shoulders. The finest and fattest is for their board, the loveliest for their couch, the best and bravest supply their foreign masters with soldiers, and whiten distant lands with their bones, leaving few here who have either the will or power to protect the unfortunate Saxton. God's blessing on our master Cedric. He hath done the work of a man in standing in the gap, but Reginald Font de Boeuf is coming down to this country in person, and we shall soon see how little Cedric's trouble will avail him. Hear, hear, he said again, raising his voice. Soho, soho! Well done, Fangs. Thou hast them all before thee now, and bring them on bravely, my lad. Girth, said the jester, I know thou thinkest me a fool, or thou wouldn't be so rash in putting thy head into my mouth. One word to Reginald Front de Bœuf, or Philip de Malvaison, that thou hast spoken treason against the Norman, and thou art but a castaway swineherd. Thou wouldst waver on one of those trees as a terror to all evil speakers against the dignity. Dog, thou wouldst not betray me, said Girth, after having led me on to speak so much at disadvantage. Betray thee, said the jester. No, that were the trick of a wise man. A fool cannot half so well help himself. But soft, what have we here? He said, as he listened to the trampling of horses which had become audible. Never mind who, said Girth, who now had gotten his herd before him, and with the aid of Fangs was driving them down one of the long dim vistas which we have endeavored to describe. Nay, I must see the riders, said Wamba. Perhaps they are come from Fairyland with a message from King Oberon. A murrain take thee, said Girth. Wilt thou talk of such things while a terrible storm of thunder and lightning is raging within a few miles of us? Hark how the thunder rumbles. And for summer rain I never saw such broad, downright flat drops fall from the clouds. The oaks, too, notwithstanding the calm weather, sob and creak with their great boughs as if announcing a tempest. Thou can play the rational if thou will. Credit me for once, and let us home ere the storm begins to rage, for night will be fearful. Wamba seemed to feel the force of this appeal, and he accompanied his companion, who began his journey after catching up a long quarterstaff which lay on the grass beside him. This second Aramis strode hastily down the forest glade, driving before him, with the assistance of Fangs, the whole herd of his inharmonious charge. And that is the end of chapter 1. I'm not going to lie, that was interesting. It seems to be setting up some sort of political intrigue between the English and French. Although, also, to be honest with you, I don't have a clue what any of that meant. So maybe somebody can explain it to me down in the comments, because sometimes this stuff just seems a little obscure to me. But we will persevere, and we will read another chapter probably tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that that made sense to you, because sometimes reading stuff out loud too just starts to feel like words and not story, especially with something I haven't read before. So I'll probably watch this back and see if it makes more sense to me. Anyway, thank you so much. Please do leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. And we will continue with Ivanhoe, which doesn't seem very romantic yet, tomorrow.